Welcome to People and Profit. I'm Kate Moody. Global unrest, shifting alliances, and increasingly pressing calls to become more self-reliant. Europe's defence industry is being reshaped and revitalised. Governments have ramped up investment, while defence, aerospace and weapons manufacturers have boosted recruitment. Over the past 5 years, EU member states have increased their defence spending by over 60% to about €380 billion in 2025. That's just over 2% of GDP. Well, I'm joined now by Jacob Parakilis, Research Leader for Defence Strategy, Policy and Capabilities at RAND Europe. Thanks so much for being with us today. Is it fair to say that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was a turning point for the way Europe looks at its defence industry?
Yes, absolutely. The increase in defense spending that we saw in Germany in particular, with Chancellor at the time Scholz referring to the turning point and seeking permission for a special investment, was mirrored across the continent, starting with the Russian invasion. It really focused attention on the need to increase Europe's defenses and invest in capabilities across land, sea, and air domains, cybersecurity, and resilience in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
EU member states since then have been increasing their security budgets. Concretely, what do we know about where that money is going?
A lot of it is going to new procurement. There are specific capabilities that European states need to ramp up and shore up their defenses at sea, on land, and in the air. A lot of it is also going to reinvigorate the industrial base. One thing that the war in Ukraine has revealed is the speed with which existing stocks of weapons are exhausted. So being able to manufacture large numbers of artillery shells, to repair damaged armored vehicles, to maintain fighter aircraft, to get them back in the fight, to train and sustain forces of all types is really critical. And the burn rate with which weapons and ammunition are used is far beyond anything that Europe has experienced in the last 30 or 40 years. So that kind of investment is really critical in order to credibly be able to be prepared for a long conventional war.
Some of this is also in response to the US President Donald Trump's recent calls for NATO members to pay more to that military alliance, which includes most but not all of EU member states, as well as countries including the US, Canada, Turkey, Iceland. Can we tie this EU initiative to NATO's recent commitment to increase that benchmark level of contribution from 2 to around 5% of GDP?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that the money isn't paid to NATO. There are national contributions to NATO, which are relatively small. They pay for NATO's international staff, its headquarters, the sort of connective tissue of the alliance itself. But the NATO target is about national spending. So a EU member that's spending more money on its own budget, which is also a NATO member, is moving towards the NATO goal at the same time by spending the same money. So in that way, even though the membership isn't aligned completely, the expenditure that's happening as a result of NATO's increased target is also to benefit EU collective defense.
All going in a certain direction then. Jacob, I do want to address Europe's long-standing reliance on American equipment and manufacturers. I'm going to ask you to stay with us for just a moment. The US President Donald Trump's recent threats over Greenland, the autonomous island that's officially part of EU member state Denmark, put a spotlight on Europe's potential vulnerability should the transatlantic alliance sour. Brian Quinn has more.
It's the ultimate symbol of Europe's dependence on American weaponry, the F-35 fighter bomber. 2 years ago, 4 new F-35s arrived in Denmark. By late January, Danish F-35s were patrolling the skies over Greenland as Donald Trump threatened to acquire it for the US by any means necessary. Though that crisis appears to have calmed, worries persist that if worst came to worst, the Americans could simply ground Denmark's F-35s.
There are constant software updates, and the F-35 is full of software. All the Americans have to do is stop supplying updates, and there would be an immediate effect.
In all, 12 European NATO countries either have or have ordered F-35s. France fields its own homegrown Rafale fighters, but it still relies on American C-130 transport planes and Reaper drones. Even when Europe makes its own weapons systems like the French-Italian Mamba interceptor missile, some countries still buy American, like the US-made Patriot missile system chosen by Germany for Europe's missile shield.
Some European countries have chosen to assume that if they buy American weapons, they'll automatically be protected by the US, and the US lets them believe this. Now, Europe is waking up and figuring out that this American promise is turning out to be not very reliable.
The percentage of European NATO countries' arms imports coming from the US has gone from 52% in 2019 up to 64% in 2024. A phenomenon that's unlikely to change anytime soon. Even France's next-generation aircraft carrier won't be fully made in France. Its jet-launching catapults will be American, a €1 billion contract.
Jacob, thanks for staying with us. Europe cannot wean itself off of American or any other manufacturers overnight. Can the EU become militarily self-sufficient? And if so, on what kind of a timeline?
I think we're talking about years into decades rather than months into years. There are several tiers of reliance that Europe has on the US. One, at the broadest level, is what you might call enabling capabilities. Things like space surveillance, logistics, heavy lift, the long-range cargo aircraft, those will be very, very difficult to replace. Those are incredibly complex systems built up over decades. Another is frontline weapons. So the F-35, for example, the Patriot missile. There are European, if not equivalents, then potential replacements. Gripen, Eurofighter, Typhoon, Rafale aircraft are all made in Europe, although to varying degrees, they all have a certain amount of American content, which is controlled by what's called ITAR, the US regulations on arms export. So there are software, there are sensors, there are elements of the engines, there are weapon systems, and things that tie all of these things together into a coherent combat aircraft, which are made in the US. But in the short term, there are things that Europe can do. It can purchase more locally made equipment, especially around the most urgent need, which is increased air defenses.
And Europe is itself home to some of the leading security firms, Thales, Leonardo, Airbus. These are big names that do certainly have a big slice of that industry. In your opinion, does the United States still produce the most advanced weapons and defense systems? And what other countries or regions are producing competitive, if not superior, technology?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is a little bit more complicated. Modern weapons are very, very rarely a single weapon that has a single purpose or single effect. They're complex systems. And the effectiveness of weapons is not just about one particular weapon having a sort of top trumps superior speed or agility or performance. It's about the way that weapons are knitted together with systems of sensors. It's about the enabling equipment. And the US sells a coherent network. It sells a system of systems that allows these things to work together. Very, very few countries sell all the individual pieces of a system of systems. China is getting close. Russia does, although its performance in Ukraine has broadly left something to be desired. Europe collectively is close, not quite there. But the problem is that there are different European companies producing different and sometimes competitive and sometimes not wholly overlapping elements of these systems. So it's harder for there to be a singular European offering, which is competitive with the singular American offering.
And so we do indeed see a lot of joint ventures and partnerships in this space. When we look at emerging defense technology, what role does artificial intelligence play?
An increasing role, although I think I would caution against some of the hype that has emerged around artificial intelligence. AI has a lot of important impacts on defense production, on sensing, on the use of weapons in modern conflict, but it's not yet at the point where it's utterly transformational. It's really in things like mission planning and in reviewing large amounts of sensor data to find potential areas of interest to be reviewed by human operators where AI is important, but that is increasing the capabilities of existing types of units and existing type of combat rather than completely changing the way that we carry out modern military campaigns.
And I briefly want to ask you about the huge and complex supply chains that this industry depends on. Recent efforts to stabilize access to things like critical minerals and rare earths are part of this more complicated effort to become more self-sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that we saw in the immediate wake of the Russian invasion was the supply shocks. And even between allied countries, there was competition in the immediate wake of the invasion for explosive precursors, for example, a very basic technology of warfare. But when the need to produce large amounts of ammunition is suddenly present, the existing supply chains for those precursors that make explosives, that make something as simple but critical as artillery shells, prove to be less resilient and less reliable than originally were thought. So I think it's really important for European governments to be thinking about their supply chains and thinking about what the backup in case a previous assumption about the reliability of the supply chain proves to be inaccurate, and making plans to stockpile and to secure additional supply chains and supply chain routes. Because it's not just the location of the materials, it's also how they get to where they need to go.
Jacob Parakilas, thank you so much for joining us on People and Profit today. Well, don't forget, you can catch all of our shows on the France 24 website or as a podcast wherever you usually listen. Until next time, thanks for watching.